Hello everyone and welcome to Lab 5. In this lab we'll be looking at setting up DNS, DHCP, and Active Directory. These three components are common and you will find them in most IT infrastructures. So to get started we're going to go through exercise 1 where we create a NAT network. This is going to be a private network just for our VMs. So to create that NAT network what we want to do is open up the VirtualBox manager. From there, we don't want to do any settings on our actual VM just yet. We want to go to, it may be File or something like that for Windows, but on Mac, I click on VirtualBox and go to Preferences. From there, we can click on the Network tab, and on the Network tab, we can create new NAT networks. So we want to create one for ourselves, and basically, we just need to give it a name. So we'll call this WinNet. And we also want to give it a network CIDR address. So let's see what we have listed in here. Basically just leaving it at the default, 10.0.2.0 with a 24-bit subnet mask. Okay. Let's uncheck the box for supporting DHCP because we're going to set up and install our own DHCP server. And after that you can click OK. And OK again. So now, even if your VM's already running, that's fine. You can see that mine's already up and running. We can click on Settings for our VM, go into Network, and then under our network adapter, we can choose NAT network, and then from there we want to choose the NAT network that we just created, so WinNet. Okay, so we'll click OK there. And that should have us set up with exercise 1. So exercise 2 has us go through and set up a static IP. Since there is no DHCP server on our NAT network, our VM is unable to get an IP address. Another reason we have to set up a static IP is because that's a prerequisite for installing Active Directory. So in exercise 2, we're going to go through and do that. And what we need to know is what do we want to make that IP be? So our default gateway is going to be on 10.0.2.1. That's just by default when we create a NAT network, it's going to be the first valid IP address in that subnet. Okay, so we'll set our IP address to be 10.0.2.10. And then we also have our other settings here as well, like our gateway and our default mask is your typical 24-bit subnet mask. Okay, so you'll probably notice your network adapter is spinning down here. It's unable to grab an IP address. Eventually, you'll probably get this yellow caution sign like I did. If we right-click on this, we can go to Open Network and Sharing Center. From here, we want to go to Change Adapter Settings in the top left. Okay, so what we see here is our network adapter, and this is the only one that I have configured right now, and that's the one that I assigned to my NAT network. If we right-click on that and go to Properties, we can view the IPv4 properties, which is where we set the address, the IP address, the subnet mask, the gateway, and the DNS servers. So to get to that, just highlight IPv4, click Properties. This radio box for obtain an IP address automatically is for DHCP. Again, we don't have that configured right now, so what we'll do is we'll set a static IP here. And for our IP, we'll have that be 10.0.2.10. So that was just randomly chosen out of the set of valid IPs in that subnet range. We'll set the subnet mask to 24 bits. And then our default gateway is always by default going to be the first valid IP address in the subnet. So for us, that's 10.0.2.1. We can also reuse that gateway as our DNS server. Alright, so once we have that, we can validate settings upon exit and click OK and close. Okay, so we couldn't identify any problems. That's good. We don't have the yellow caution sign down here anymore, so that's good. One thing that we can do is we can open up a command prompt and verify that these settings have been saved. So if we do ipconfig/all, we'll see our Ethernet adapter here has an IP address of 10.0.2.10 like we assigned it, the default gateway, and we can also see the DNS server. In addition to that, we can also make sure that we can look things up like google.com. So if we try to ping google.com, the server is going to have to use the DNS server to resolve the mnemonic google.com to the IP address. And since I was able to do that, I'm able to verify that DNS is working as well as networking is working, as I'm able to get out and actually get a reply from google.com here. Alright, so the next thing we want to do is we want to install Active Directory domain services. So this is what's going to actually set up our domain for us. So let's go ahead and walk through those steps. So this is a role that we'll be installing. You can open up Server Manager and feel free to close out of some of these other windows that we have open. Okay, so once we have that up, go ahead and right click on roles and click Add Roles. We want to install Active Directory domain services, so we'll check that. As part of that, we'll need .NET 3.5.1 installed. So we can also add that from here and it'll take care of that for us. And we'll just click Next, Next. It's letting us know what it is going to install. And we can just click Install here and wait for the installation to finish. Okay, so once that's done, we'll see that the installation succeeded for not only the .NET Framework 3.5.1, but also for Active Directory domain services. So from there, we can go ahead and close out of the wizard. And we want to expand the roles node, and we'll see Active Directory domain services. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do when we set up a domain is we want to promote our current server to be the domain controller. And we use DC Promo to do that. There's a nice hyperlink right here that makes that easy, so we can just click that. And we're going to walk through the wizard now. So click Next, Next. We want to create a new domain and a new forest. For the FQDN, we can make this whatever we want. I'm using my coastalid.com, so canance.com. Feel free to use yours as well. We'll click Next. Alright, we want to set the forest functional level. This is basically with each new operating system, new functionality comes out for Active Directory domain. So we can go ahead and set ours to the highest one, 2008 R2. Click Next. Okay, for an additional option, we want to make sure that the DNS server is checked. DNS server is required for Active Directory, and we're going to run one on the same server that we're running Active Directory on. So we'll click Next there. We will get this warning about DNS delegation. That's okay. We can go ahead and click Yes for Continue there. And then from here we can accept the defaults. So the default location for the database, the log files, and the sysvol folder. We need to set a password. So make sure that you remember this password. This is going to be for the administrator account on the domain. So technically that is separate from the administrator account that is for your local server that we've been logging in with so far. Alright, so once that finishes, Active Directory domain services should be installed, so we can click Finish, and we'll need to restart the server. Alright, so once that's rebooted, you'll see that the login prompt is a little bit different. We have our domain name in front of our username, so we're going to log in with the domain administrator account, and that's going to be using the password that we just set in the wizard previously. All right, the last thing we want to do for this exercise is look at DNS. So DNS was something that was installed with Active Directory domain services. And if we click on that, we can expand our server and look at the forward lookup zones. We'll see that there's an entry for the domain that we created, canance.com in my case. And if I double click on that, we'll see that there's a few entries in here that were automatically placed in here by Active Directory. So one being a host record for our server. So canance-server, that's this particular machine, that's the host name for it. We created an A record with its IP address, so the 10.0.2.10 that we set earlier. Anytime that a new machine joins the domain, it's going to have an A record created in here so that we can reference the machine by its mnemonic name instead of by its IP address. Alright, so in exercise 4, we want to go ahead and configure DHCP. Again, we're going to be adding another role to our machine, so we can open up Server Manager, right-click on Roles, click Add Roles, and check DHCP. From there, we can just click Next. It's going to ask what interface we would like for it to listen on. We only have one, so this 10.0.2.10 is just fine. Okay, so here we want to set up just a couple settings. One is our parent domain. canance.com is fine. That is the domain that this exists in. The preferred DNS server. We don't want for this to be localhost. Of course, that's going to work for this machine, since this machine has DNS running on it. But if we have another machine join, its localhost more than likely won't have a DNS server. So what we want to do is set it to its in this case, a private IP address, the 10.0.2.10. And if we wanted to, we could put in a second alternative DNS server. Typically in an environment, we would have redundant DNS servers, so we would have another one set up on a separate server. We would probably also set up a second instance of Active Directory so that it has a failover as well. But for now, we're fine with one. After we put in that IP address, we'll click Validate, and it checks and makes sure that it is valid and listening for DNS. So we can click Next here. We don't have to do anything with Win, so not required. And for now, we'll configure the scopes after we get this installed. So let's go ahead and click Next. We can disable DHCP v6, use the current credentials, and click Install. Alright, once that's successful, we can go ahead and close this and close out a server manager. Like most of our administrative tools, the way that we can access an interface to manage this is to go to Start, Administrative Tools, DHCP. So we'll see our server in here. This is our DHCP server. We want to look at IPv4, and it's telling us that we need to add a scope. So to add a scope, let's just right click on IPv4, click New Scope, and we can walk through this wizard here. So we need to give it a name and description. I'll just call this default scope. And this is a range of IP addresses that we're willing to hand out for DHCP. So we don't always want to use the whole subnet. Sometimes we want to have some area that we can put in static IPs. So for us, we're going to use everything from 10.023 to 10.0.219 for static IPs, as well as 10.0.2.221 up to 224, just for static IPs. And everything in between that we can use for DHCP. So where do we want to start at? That'd be 10.0.220, and we want to end at 10.0.2.200. Our subnet mask is 24 bits. Okay, so we want to make sure we get that correct, and we can click Next. We can do exclusions if we want. We don't want to do that right now though, so we can click Next here. And the duration of the scope leases is something that we can configure. For us, we'll be okay leaving it at 8 days. For a network that's going to see a lot of traffic, for instance, we've run into this problem before in an old job where the library was constantly seeing new devices and having to hand out new IP addresses. Well, if the lease time is very long, then what can happen is you'll exhaust all of your IP space, and there won't be any to give that new device when it comes on. So the solution for us was to change the lease time, as well as to add another scope, so there's more subnet or more IP addresses available to hand out. All right, so we'll leave this alone at 8 days. We want to configure DHCP options right now. No, we'll worry about that later. Okay, so click Next. Now we need to activate this. So if we right click on the scope, we can click Activate. If we come back here, we see that it's now active. So if we look at the address pool, we can see our range from 20 up to 200, and any leases that we have, which we don't have any leases right now at all. Alright, so there is one more thing that we want to do before we can test this out. So the last thing we want to do is set our router, our gateway that we're going to hand out to clients when they request a DHCP lease. So to do that, that's under Scope Options. If we right click here, we can go to Configure Options. Option number 3 is Router. That's what we want to configure. If we check that, we can then put in our gateway for this particular network, which is 10.0.2.1, and then hit Apply. So what you'll notice is these are some of the same settings that we had to set when we created a static IP. And that's the whole purpose of DHCP, is to provide these settings to the users on our network so that we don't have to go around and manually set them or hand out a sheet of paper that has those settings on them. So one thing we can do to test this is we can take another VM. So I happen to have a few other VMs here, so let's grab one and see if we can't get a DHCP lease. So I'll start up Windows 10. What we can do is we need to plug this into the same network. So let's come in, let's go to Network Settings for this VM. And we'll switch this to NAT network and put it on the same WinNet that we have our Active Directory domain controller on. So this is sort of analogous to plugging it into the same switch that this network's located on. We'll click OK here. So it is going to change our network stuff. So we can see down here we have an X currently. And it looks like now it's resolved. So let's do this. Let's open up a command prompt. Okay, so we can check and make sure that we got the correct IP address and settings by running ipconfig/all. And if we scroll up and just look at our Ethernet adapter, we'll see that the DNS suffix is canants.com, so that was the domain. Our default gateway is the 10.0.2.1, that was that router option we just put in. The DHCP server is 10.0.2.10, that's our Windows server, or our domain controller now. And it's also our DNS server, so we can see that as well. In addition to that, we can just try to ping google.com and make sure we have connectivity, and we see that that's working as well. Now if we jump back to our server 2008, we should be able to refresh this leases view, and we can see that we have one machine that has a lease, and it has a client IP address that we just saw, the 10.0.2.20. Alright, so the last thing we want to do is we want to create an Active Directory user. So to do that, we can use Active Directory users and computers. As you can probably guess, we can find that under our administrative tools. And up towards the top is where we'll find that, users and computers. We want to expand our domain. So this is our domain. It's organized sort of logically into a hierarchy here. Users is obviously where users will typically go. So in here, we can create a new user. So I'm going to add an account for myself here. And for my logon name, I'll just use my first name. Click next. We need to put in a password. Typically, we'll allow a user to change that password on the first login because we have to set something. Additionally, we could disable an account if we wanted to just have one created that is currently not enabled, maybe used for a vendor or something. If we didn't want for the password to adhere to the password policy, then we could say that it never expires. But for us, we can leave these all alone. Click next here and finished. Oh, and I didn't choose a password that was tough enough, so let me go back and just put in something different. Okay, so we see that we have that user account created. Something else we may want to do, since this is ours, is we can go in and add this user to domain admins, which gives them admin ability on the domain. It also typically will give them administrative access on a local server when they log onto it. So let's double click on domain admins. You'll see that that is a security group. If we double click on that, we can look at the members. Right now the only member is administrator. That was the original account that we created. But let's add another one. So anytime you want to add an account, we typically use this little search box. And here we can put in the account name, and if we hit check, it'll go out and find it, and we can see it found it because it shows the first name, last name, username at domain. So from here, just go ahead and click OK. OK. And now if we go back into our user account, we can see what groups this user is a member of by clicking on the Member Of tab. And what you'll see is our account is now a member of domain admins, and by default, all users are members of domain users. So we can click OK there as well. Alright, so from here, let's go ahead and log off and try to log in with our new account. We want to switch users. Notice that it says log on to CANants, so that's the domain. We can just use our username and then the password that we assigned. let me know that I must change it before my first log on. Oh, and it has to be something different. So let's put in something else here. Awesome. So we are able to log in. It's going to go ahead and set up our desktop. The last thing I want to show you guys is if we have other machines on our network, we can join them to the domain as well. So let's go back to that Windows 10 box. And before I do this, I'm just going to take a snapshot so I can reset this back later on. Snapshots are great because they let us basically take a snapshot of what memory looks like and what the hard drive looks like and everything at this point in time. We can do some things, and if we'd like to, we can roll back to when that snapshot was taken. Okay, so let's go ahead and join this domain. So to do that, we need to go to Computer, open up a File Explorer, and click on this PC, Properties, Advanced System Settings. On the Computer Name tab, in here we can change from a domain or a work group. So if we click Change here, we can join a domain. We want to join canance.com. Now before we do this, it's very crucial that we already have our DNS server, our DNS settings pointing towards the DNS server of our domain controller, which it is because we have a DHCP address. But that's how it's going to resolve where canance.com is. So if we click OK here, it's going to ask me for some credentials so that we can join that domain. I will just use the administrator account. So it goes out, joins the domain. We can click OK here, and it needs to go ahead and do a restart. So we'll go ahead and reboot now. While that's rebooting, let's jump back over to our server 2008 R2, and let's go back into Active Directory Users and Computers. If we expand our domain and look in the Computers node, we can see that there is one computer. Marge, that's my Windows 10 VM, so we can see that we have joined that machine to the domain. And now anybody with the ability to log on to that from the domain is able to use their domain credentials. We come back over here. Okay, I'm going to log in with the other users. We're going to sign into CANance. If it didn't say that we needed to sign on to a different domain, we could put the domain in front, followed by a backslash. And we'll log on with that account that I just created. Notice it was able to pull my first and last name from Active Directory. And it should now be setting up the desktop for my first login. Alright, so I hope you guys enjoyed the lab. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. If not, I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you.